All right, today we're going to talk about conflict. And really, we're just going to do an introduction of the four main players of exploration and colonization. We have three European nations and the American Indians. So we can see here we've got the Spanish, the French, the English, and American Indians, and this gives us a good summary of what they all are. And what their interactions were. Interaction is one of our vocabulary words, an exchange of ideas or products. I'm having an interaction with you right now, giving you information. When you're watching TV and watching an ad, that's an interaction. You're going shopping, you're interacting. So the interaction between the European nations and the American Indians is very, very important. Um, So much so that, Columbus, as we discussed earlier, if he landed on a different island, him and his men most likely would have been killed by the fierce Caribbeans that were waiting for them just across the water, very, very close. But instead, he ran into a very friendly tribe, and things worked out very well for him. So when these Europeans are coming over, they have a very different idea of what land ownership is, and this picture is a very bleak look at the interactions between the Europeans and the American Indians. It wasn't always like this. In fact, quite a bit was not. Um, uh, with each country, they had their own style and what they did with the Indians. So the Indians would have very different um, relations uh, with each of the countries. So let's take a closer look at what was going on here. And we have the conquistadors. We'll start right there. Another one of our vocabulary words is a Spanish word for a person who conquers. Conquistadors, conquer. Conquistadors used force to take whatever they wanted. And that brings us right here. From Spain, the conquistadors. These were the guys that came and conquered and enslaved the American Indians. They were not nice about it. They would come over, do what we tell you to do, or we're going to, you know, anyway. So they introduced the Christian faith to the Americas, and as we'll see tomorrow when we take a closer look at Spain, there's a reason why they were so brutal towards the Indians and why they insisted that they converted to the Christian faith. They also established missions. Missions are like church schools or school churches. It's a combination of the two, and they would put it in every town to help the Indians learn about Christianity and be educated in the Spanish ways, learn how to speak Spanish and so forth. The French were much nicer about things. They're known as the traders. We're going to remember them as the traders. They would set up a network of trading for all these posts around so that they can get furs, and the American Indians were actually pretty grateful for setting up trade routes. They were very interested in the European products. If you remember, you look around at the American Indians, the tools that they're using are made of wood and stone. Um, they would use pots, things that broke, things that didn't last, weren't as sharp as the metal items that the Europeans are bringing over, like the axes, the swords, spoons, bowls, everyday things that people are interested in. The Europeans had a superior quality of these items, and they were very happy to trade with the French and whoever else for these great things that the Europeans were bringing over. And the Europeans were very happy about getting these natural items that they had, like furs. They had a tremendous amount of natural resources here in the Americas that the Europeans were interested in. The French were also interested in converting the Indians into the Christian religion, but it was a very different way of doing things. Instead of going around punching people in the face, forcing you, join our religion or die, the French were more like, hey, we got these nice things that you may want to trade. And oh, by the way, we have this religion. We'd like you to join. Why don't you listen to us about that? And so there was a very good relationship between the Indians and the French, and whatever conversions they did have, they were, very solid. Um, so it wasn't forced uh, conversions here with the French, whereas the Spanish is very different. The English are going to be known as the settlers. Now, like the French, they traded with the American Indians. They were very interested in trade. Um, they learned new farming techniques from the Indians. You would think that the Europeans would know how to farm. They did, but the land here was different. Um, when they first came across to areas in New England, you could see from this map right here, the English are the light blue, and they started really up here in New England, and the land there was um, more sandy. You couldn't grow the types of things that you normally would be growing in Europe, and they weren't necessarily shipping over great farmers from Europe to the Americas. So the American Indians did help the English quite a bit getting their farms going because the English weren't just interested in coming over here and trading like the French. They weren't just coming over here to conquer like the Spanish. They wanted to come here and live permanently. This was going to be their new home, so they needed to learn how to farm and sustain themselves for a long time. The problem is that once they got here and they started settling on Native American land, the whole idea of ownership came into question. Okay, so what you have to understand is that the American Indians looked at land very differently than the Europeans. Europeans look at land like we do. Your parents buy a house on some land. That's their land. That's their property. Nobody can come and start building a house in your parents' backyard. It's not allowed. That's their land. They get to decide what goes on in their backyard, not somebody else. So I mean, if you imagine you have a house and somebody starts building a big building or a house in your backyard, you're gonna say, "Hey, what are you doing?" So the Europeans had that kind of concept of land ownership, whereas American Indians did not. So the American Indians looked at land more like air. Imagine me saying, or somebody saying next to you, "Hey, this is my air. You see this air around me? This is my air. Don't breathe my air. I can only breathe this air. You have to breathe that air on the other side of the room. I get to breathe this air." You would think I'm an idiot, wouldn't you? I mean, and you'd be absolutely right. You would say, "Look, I can breathe this air. You can breathe it. Air is air. Everybody breathes air." So the Indians had a similar concept of land. No one can own the land. The land is for using. Everybody uses the land. You go hunting. You go pick berries. There's no owning of land. So when the Europeans came over and said, "Okay, we claim this land. This is our land," the Indians really didn't think too much of it. They thought it was kind of silly until the Europeans started building forts and fences and keeping the Indians off the land where they would hunt or gather food, and then the Indians realized, okay, this is a problem, and that's where the conflict would come in. So it wasn't the type of conflict where like the Spanish, would just come in and just beat them up. They would come in and establish their settlements and kind of cordon off the Indians from their land, and then the Indians would not like that, and of course the conflict would come in there. Whereas they didn't have that problem with the French. So here when we're looking at American Indians, they believe that the land was to be shared and used, but not owned. Very important. Make sure you remember that. Indians believe that land should be shared and used, but not owned. They cooperated by teaching farming techniques to the European settlers who would have starved to death without the Indians' help, so they're very important to the colonization effort. And they traded with European weapons and farm tools. Oh, let me just say something real quick about the helping of Europeans. When you see a group of people come in with amazing things like muskets and metal tools and so forth, you're going to think, I mean, if aliens came down and had ray guns, had things, the governments are going to be interested in those items, and so they're going to try to be friendly. They're going to try to help those aliens out that crash onto our planet and are starving and need to get food and so forth. Um, Not that there's aliens, but just saying, trying to make something that we can understand here with. But the Indians um, would help the Europeans sometimes out of kindness, sometimes out of convenience that they wanted to ally themselves with these new people that had new technologies that they wanted. So when looking at this map here, you have the English over here around Hudson Bay. The famous explorer Henry Hudson went into this Hudson Bay and claimed all this land for England. And then we have, of course, the 13 colonies area, Newfoundland, and then the purple area, and its center is really around two rivers. The river right here is St. Lawrence River, and then the river over here is the Mississippi River. Hope you guys already said that before I said anything. And the Spanish are really throughout here from Southwest America all the way through Central America, all the way down to the very bottom, tippy bottom of South America. And the Portuguese claimed this part. There was a treaty that was signed by the Pope to give them this part of South America, which is why we have Brazil. Brazil is a former Portuguese colony, and the rest of these are Spanish colonies. So that's why they all speak Spanish through here. You got the Portuguese speaking here, and then English spoken through here, and of course French is spoken here in Quebec. And if you remember New Orleans, there's a lot of people that have at least a strange French accent, and that's all because of who settled there in these areas.